So our guest speaker today is Dr. Katie Gold. She is assistant professor as the grape pathologist that took over Wayne Wilcox's position. I'm starting to read off the list, the website, Katie. I apologize, it's somebody up there. So she's assistant professor of grape pathology in the plant pathology and plant microbiology section of the School of Integrative Plant Science at Cornell. Here she holds primary research and extension responsibilities for grape disease management in New York State. And she'll probably tell you a little bit more about herself, but if you are getting all of our crop updates and newsletters, the newsletter that we sent out last month was actually her guidelines for 2021. So with all of that, Katie, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule.
Well, thank you for inviting me
to talk with us. You are a host. I believe you're a co-host. So if you have anything you want to share.
Yep, let me just get these slides. So are we seeing this in presenter mode or are we seeing
now it's presenter mode? Yes.
So is it full screen or are you seeing presenter mode?
Full screen.
Oh, good. Okay. That's just what I wanted to confirm. Alrighty. Hi, everyone. So thank you so much, Jen, for the invitation to speak here. And I hope everyone's season is getting off to a good start, though I was really saddened to hear that there was some frost damage across the region. I'm really sorry for those who are dealing with that. So hopefully we will have a, fingers crossed for a really nice disease season, nice, not in pathologist terms, nice in grower terms. So let's just hope for that so we don't have anything too rough. So today I just wanted to start with a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about, reviewing the core tenets of early season grape disease management with a specific focus on Concord and juice grapes. And then that'll make up the vast majority of the talk. But what I will also present is a little bit of some recent research that we were able to conduct last summer through blood, sweat, and tears. I can't say that I recommend launching a research lab during a global pandemic, but I am very proud of what my team was able to accomplish. So testing out some new biopesticides for powdery mildew and downy mildew control, and then wrapping up very briefly with just some of our upcoming summer research plans, including a bit on our new black rot trial, which will take place in our Niagara pathology vineyards.
Katie, may I interrupt you just briefly?
Oh, yes.
If somebody has a question in the chat box, do you want me to raise my hand? Would you like me just to say, Katie, there's a question?
Sure. Yeah. How about, can you alert me? So I can't, just the way I have it set up, I won't see the chat notifications. So if you want to chime in or do the hand, either will work because I can see you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. So this is our cast of characters. This is not the best venue to learn how to do disease ID. So I'm going to hope that you guys have some familiarity with them. I've got our late season bunch rods on the right side, not because we have to manage for them in the early season, but because their incidence and severity can be related to what we do in terms of managing our early season diseases, which are kind of collectively black rot, downy mildew, anthracnose, powdery mildew, and phomopsis. What I do want to highlight here is that there are two relatively new products to New York, both which became available in the 2020 season. The first of which is Gatin. This is a new MOA for powdery mildew control and provided excellent control after multiple years of study at Cornell, spanning Wayne's program into mine. Additionally, I wanted to mention that there is a new DMI product called Cedia, which has recently been labeled in New York. Now, right now, this does have a variety restriction for Concord and Labrusca, but I was talking to the rep and he let me know that it's actually, they've had a new label approved by the EPA that has removed this restriction. So it should be labeled for Concord and other juice grape usage as of the 2022 season. And this product provided ranging from good to excellent powdery mildew control, depending on the season. Brian Head at Penn State tested it for black rot control over 1 year, provided excellent control for that as well. So I think that's great to know coming next season that we can look for this product and its usage in juice grape. So I asked Jen for kind of an update on where we are, and I hear it's about phomopsis spray time, kind of like a 1 to 5 inch shoot growth range. So if you have not yet made plans for your phomopsis spray, I would recommend you start thinking about that now. And this is just kind of like an overview of what we think about throughout the season. Now I'm going to start from the very beginning, but I do want to highlight this, that we're really starting to approach this period of very convergent importance for control of our early season diseases, especially 6 to 10 inch shoot growth, which is just going to be just around the corner. Also, I saw Terry Bates' email this morning. They're predicting bloom to occur at Clairol around June 8th, which is about a week earlier than historic. Not sure how that will relate to each of your specific farms in your specific areas, but just something to keep in mind is that we might have a slightly earlier bloom this year, which is something you'll want to be aware of as you're considering your immediate pre and immediate post bloom sprays. So now let's start with the very beginning. And early season disease control begins with sanitation. So we're a little past the snowy kind of point of the season, given that it's May. We'd all hope we would be. But I do want to talk about where pathogens overwinter because sanitation is so importantly linked to that. So of our diseases, well, our pathogens that cause these diseases that overwinter in the bark, there's three main ones: anthracnose, phomopsis, and powdery mildew. And these guys will release spores from the bark with the spring rain. So I want to highlight for a moment phomopsis because of its importance for Concord and juice grape. Your 1 to 3 inch spray for phomopsis really pays for itself. Wayne did some awesome research on the economics of this. If you have not made plans to make this spray or have made it already, please do consider doing so. Of the products that you can use for this, Mancozeb, Xyrem, and Captan are your best bets to go with. Also, these will cover anthracnose as well if you've had a historic problem with it. Anthracnose is kind of like, the black sheep, maybe not the black sheep, just kind of like the small duckling of the family, the runt of the litter. It's not truly a huge problem, but when you do have a vineyard with an anthracnose problem, it can be difficult to get rid of. And this early season phomopsis spray will help take care of those problems. In terms of cultural control, you're going to want to prune the canes and as well as chop and shred them and or remove them for the vineyard. If you've had a historic problem with phomopsis, I just recommend removing them from the vineyard entirely. If that's not an option, chop, shred, and destroy them that way. In terms of post-bloom management for phomopsis, if you've had a really bad problem with it historically, you may want to consider some protection and post-bloom time on your clusters. But this, if you're rotating in post-bloom, actually, you're probably not going to be using Manzate anymore. But your contact protectants such as Captan or Mancozeb, that should cover phomopsis as well. But you would want to consider this, especially if the weather is wet. So now I'm going to jump into our one early season disease that has a kind of unique overwintering location, which is black rot. So black rot is unique among our early season diseases is that its overwintering structure is actually within these shriveled up berries that we call mummies. And these mummies will overwinter in the trellis or on the ground if they've fallen off. When we have rain, this will trigger the release of spores, and these mummies that are in the trellis in particular will rain down spores onto our growing green tissue. And these spores are capable of causing infection on any available green tissue or berry structure, and they are most potent in the early season. So this is why removal of the black rot mummies before green tissue starts to appear is absolutely essential. If you have not done this removal already, there still is time to do so before black rot control becomes absolutely necessary. I would not delay if you have not done this already.
Katie,
yeah, go for it.
Sorry, there's actually a question already that
Oh,
popped
okay,
up.
great.
And it says, is the removal of mummies essential if spray coverage is adequate?
I'm about to get to that. Yes.
Oh,
thank you
nice
for that.
question.
Perfect transition question. So this is why removal of mummies is so important. So mummies that are retained on the vine will produce 10 to 20 times more spores than the mummies on the ground. And they will continue to produce spores from bud break through veraison. And this just because of where their location is, they are producing spores that are not only more abundant, they're more likely to hit susceptible tissue. So if we think about the disease triangle, I can't help myself, I'm a true pathologist making this little triangle. Conducive environment, susceptible host, virulent pathogen, leaving the mummies in the trellis truly sets you up for really all three conditions. So that is why removing the mummies from the trellis is so important. They produce more spores, they're more virulent, they will keep producing those spores all the way through veraison. And then those spores are just more likely to hit something and cause damage. Now, in contrast that, so if you do go through and remove the mummies from the trellis and put them on the ground, they will decompose much more quickly than vine mummies. Vine mummies is the best place for a mummy, like the trellis is the best place for a mummy to be. You put it on the ground, they're going to just decompose, get rid of themselves much more quickly. And additionally, these guys will not produce spores after bloom. And additionally, the spores that they do produce, just because of their physical location now on the ground, those spores that they make are so much less likely to get splashed up into the trellis, as well as hitting that super susceptible fruit in the early season and that nice little susceptible green tissue. So the exception to this with mummies on the ground is that if the weather has been particularly dry, then the ground mummies will remain a source of spores for significantly longer. But they still will, those spores that they're producing are still just so much less likely to hit something that it can affect. So that is why removal from the mummies, removal of mummies from the trellis is so important, even if you have really great spray coverage. So I'm glad that question was asked. That was perfect timing. I'm happy to continue ranting on about mummy removal, but I think for everyone's sake, I'm going to move on to powdery mildew for a little bit. Powdery mildew, the most notorious grape pathogen in the world. We all deal with it every year. While we do know it overwinters on the cane, it does tend to really become a visible development of it later in the season. Though if we think back to that table, which I will pop back up for you guys at some point, control for powdery mildew actually becomes of importance, between 6 to 10 inch shoot growth. Whereas downy mildew, sorry, I get my mildews mixed up, is a little bit after that period. Powdery mildew spores do not require free water to germinate. They just require high humidity. So this disease is favored when you have humidity above 80% and temperatures in the range of 68 to 80 Fahrenheit. Also, something to note is that powdery mildew is unique amongst our early season diseases in that it lives its entire life on the surface of the grapevine. It does not go in and burrow and establish itself into the tissue. It feeds by dropping sinkers into the very top layer of cells. And this is why some alternative products, or maybe not alternative, like oil, salts, lots of contact, and also eradicants are so effective for powdery mildew, where they do not have that same efficacy for our other early season diseases. So just to kind of sum up those 4 diseases already talked about of the main 5, anthracnose, phomopsis, and powdery mildew, the causal organisms, all overwinter in the canes and within the trellis. So removing your prunings from the vineyard, or at the minimum chopping and shredding to remove that bark where they're overwintering, is very important for early season disease control and reducing that initial inoculum load. And this will be of particular importance if you had a rough season this year. Additionally, we went over why it's so important to remove your black rot mummies from the trellis, burn, bury, compost them if you've had a really historic problem, or at the bare minimum, just drop them onto the ground. So this is an early season sanitation is important for all these guys. Unfortunately, it is not useful at all for our friend downy mildew. And this is because downy mildew is unique amongst our early season diseases, is that it's not actually caused by a true fungi like our other guys are. It's caused by an organism called an omycete, or a group of organisms. And these organisms are actually more closely related, fungi are actually more closely related to animals than they are to omycetes, even though they look and generally behave very similarly. But they do have important differentiations that result in different management considerations. They have special spore types, and they can also require specialty omicides to control. And these special spore types are the real reason why downy mildew is not affected by early season sanitation. So the resting spores of the downy mildew pathogen called ospores, I don't know why I just lost that word. They overwinter in the leaf debris and the top layer of the soil, and they're extremely long-lived. There are downy mildews and other omycetes that are capable of surviving for up to 20 years in the soil. So these spores will remain viable for greater than 1 season within the soil, though they are the most viable within that first year afterwards. So if you had a bad year of downy mildew, you're going to have a bad year the next year if you're not really careful about your control. And they have an incredible tolerance for cold and drought. And they don't necessarily need that leaf debris to survive. So if you were to go through and remove all that leaf debris, then the spores would just get knocked out into the soil and they would be just as happy. So this is why oh, sorry, that little animation didn't go through correctly. This is why downy mildew is not impacted by early season sanitation, because of where these specialty spore types overwinter. So just summing up where these pathogens overwinter for their sanitation, in the canes in the wood, we have anthracnose, phomopsis, and powdery mildew. So your pruning and also your dormant sprays, we're a little bit past that in Concord if you did want to make that choice, will reduce your initial spore load. Black rot overwinters in the mummies on either in the vine or the ground. And we went over why removing those mummies from the trellis is so important. And additionally, we have downy mildew that overwinters in the leaf litter and the top layer of soil, which is unfortunately not affected by pruning or dormant sprays at all because of its inherent biology as a non-fungal organism. So now kind of transitioning into chemical management, but first starting with the foundations of an effective spray program that are not rooted in just true chemical management. An effective spray program will always begin with cultural control. And this is because all fungicides work better when disease pressure is lower. So you want to be training and pruning to increase airflow and also spray penetration. So this really gets you a 2-for-1 special in terms of disease control benefits. Not only will having a nice flowy canopy result in a less conducive environment for disease, it will also help your fungicides that you've spent so much money on get to the part of the plant where they provide the best and most effective control. It doesn't matter how much you put into the tank, it matters how much you put onto the vine, and not just onto the vine, onto the part of the vine where the pathogen is trying to attack. We reviewed already why early season sanitation is so important for removing that initial inoculum. And I also want to remind my kind of annual reminder about calibrating your sprayer, especially if you hear me say calibrate your sprayer annually and you're like, oh, I can't remember the last time I calibrated my sprayer, then it is definitely time to calibrate your sprayer. And this is because it gets back to that spray penetration, and our fungicides, they don't work in the tank, they work on the vine. So we want to give them the best starting point possible to give the best coverage of the right rates. Additionally, scouting early and often will help you catch little problems before they cascade into big problems. Additionally, an effective fungicide program is going to be simple. We want simultaneous control of the most important diseases. We don't want to be spraying individual products when we can just spray a single one and get multiple diseases at once. We also want to be aware of fungicide resistance management and our best stewardship practices. This is because fungicides are unfortunately use them and lose them. We don't want to lose these great products that we have that preserve and sustain our industry through their overuse. So it's important to be good stewards of these and recognize and follow fungicide resistance management guidelines. And additionally, importantly, we always want to be cognizant of economic sustainability. It doesn't help anyone if we're going out and going broke just keeping our vineyards alive. Additionally, I just want to put up here on the right side, as Concord growers, there are a number of products that are known to cause damage on Concord as well as Vitis labrusca grapes and hybrids. Some of those are pristine, difenoconazole in particular, which is part of Quattros top. So if anything with a top in it, also Inspire Super that has difenoconazole. Flint Extra is known to cause damage, as well as Luna Sensation, not because of the Luna, but because of the sensation, and Intuity as well. These should not be used on Concord grapes. And then just kind of the final point here is that diversification is really key. A robust and durable spray program is going to include both protectants, so contact fungicides, as well as post-infection materials, systemics, particularly at the most important time of year for control, which I'm gonna seamlessly transition into right now. So the most important time for disease control, the period of peak susceptibility, is going to be this time span spanning immediate pre-bloom through about 2 weeks post-bloom, or so immediate pre-bloom to immediate post-bloom. And these, whatever number of sprays you make within this region, I recommend generally at least 3. It's because it's the most important for downy mildew, black rot, and powdery, because most these pathogens, they prefer soft, succulent tissue and immature berries. And if symptoms become widespread, control will become nearly impossible for that year. And additionally, it will really set you up to be in a bad spot in the next year too, because that inoculum will overwinter. This is why early season disease control really pays for itself. So the kind of rule of thumb coverage for this period of time is in juice grapes, you want to make sure you're covering from 10-inch shoots through pea-sized fruits. This is usually about 2 to 3 weeks post-bloom. And you absolutely do not want to delay past immediate pre-bloom. After this period of time, 2 to 3 weeks post-bloom, your Concord berries and other Labrusca grapes and hybrids will become resistant to downy mildew, powdery mildew, and black rot. This is the onset of what we call ontogenic resistance. The pathogens are no longer capable of establishing infections, new infections on your berries. So you get your entire berry control for the year in the early season. In particular with powdery mildew, on Concord, you will likely not need protection on your clusters past 1/4 inch in diameter. So just as a reminder, this is the period of time at which you want to use your best fungicide. This is when you want to be putting on your Bovando and your other big dogs, highest rate. And you also want to be following all the rules and sticking to your intervals within this period, and especially being aware of your intervals when disease is conducive. And as a note, bloom is predicted to occur around June 8th this year, at least at Clairol. So this period of time might be might begin a little earlier this year than it has historically. So now,
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. There are a couple questions.
Yep, let's go for it.
Okay, one says that they've always heard that Niagaras are more prone to downy than Concords. Is it true? And if so, why? Do you know about that?
So I've heard that too. And I have to be honest, I don't know why. I wish I could give you a better answer than that, but I don't know why they're more prone to downy mildew. I would say, there's got to be some difference between Concord and Niagara. I do know that with the Vitis Gen program that they have identified more types of or more downy mildew resistance loci from Concord than they have from Niagara. So if you put a gun to my head and told me to make an educated guess, I would say it's because of the number of resistance loci or something related to that. But my true answer is I don't know, and that's just speculation.
Why, thank you. And the next question is, in the days and weeks, what is the difference between 1/4 inch and pea size? Then they said, what kind of pea? I don't know if they're being silly on that one, but
I don't know. I'm trying to cover all my bases here because everyone does have a different definition of pea. I think it depends on you and whatever makes the most sense to you. If the pea size doesn't mean anything to you, maybe hopefully 1/4 inch does. If 1/4 inch don't mean anything to you, maybe pea size does. I'm just trying to cover all my bases here.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have so far. Keep submitting them to me if you have any.
Yeah, please do, and keep interrupting me so I can answer them as we go.
Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm just going to go over some kind of general considerations for both building and evaluating your spray program. And these guidelines are sourced from the FRAME network. This is the Fungicide Resistance and Mitigation and Extension Network. This is a really wonderful SCRI that's kind of primarily focused on mitigating strobilurin or QOI, FRAC 11 resistance and powdery mildew, but they're putting out some amazing extension materials on general fungicide resistance management, which is a concern for all of us, no matter what grape type we're growing. So things that you want to consider when you're building your spray program for the season and also kind of taking that critical eye to it, making sure that it's doing what you want it to do. First thing you want to consider is when you want your program to start. And you want to be considering vine phenology as well as disease biology when considering the start date. So certain diseases such as powdery mildew, downy mildew, and botrytis bunch rot, they do not warrant management approaches pre-bud break. Your dormant spray is not going to get you anything for these guys, versus your potentially your trunk diseases, definitely your Phomopsis and Anthracnose. These guys may benefit from pre-bud break sprays. So do you want to go with the dormant spray or not? You really want to ask yourself, what am I trying to manage for? And whether or not a cultural practice such as more pruning or just ensuring and making sure those prunings are removed from the vineyard might get you further than making that dormant or early season spray. Opposite of this will be program end date, the kind of opposite. So as the season progresses, you want to critically ask yourself, are the sprays that I'm making needed for the disease that I'm targeting? So each grapevine disease has a different window for when it impacts the vine the most. And while so many of our diseases, and in particular powdery mildew and downy mildew, do threaten our canopy through the end of the season, your need for spraying and kind of the intervals you're going to take will be shifting during that time, especially if you've nailed your early season disease control and your cluster control. So if you've done a really good job of managing for disease on your fruit, and that you've also generally done a good job of managing for disease on your canopy, and the weather is pretty like favorable to grapes and not favorable to pathogens, you know, you might be able to stretch your intervals a bit during the late season and thinking about when you want to end. So just really critically say, like, you know, are these sprays needed for the disease that I'm targeting and that I'm trying to manage for? Additionally, if you would like to use pre-mixed products, I do want to caveat that the example that I have here is technically not applicable to Concord directly, because neither of those two products are recommended for Concord, but the kind of theoretical framework of it still stands. So it's still a useful example. And when you're utilizing a pre-mixed product, you want to be paying attention to the label, specifically both the FRAC code as well as the active ingredient, to make sure you're following the best resistance stewardship practices. A really good example of this is that if you were to spray Inspire Super, which is a combo FRAC 3 and 9, 3 being our DMI fungicides, followed by Revis Top for downy mildew, this is a combo 40 and 3, you have not only sprayed 2 DMI fungicides in a row, but you've actually sprayed the same active ingredient back to back, which is kind of like the biggest no-no in terms of fungicide resistance management. So it's really important when you're looking at those pre-mixed products, not to just go by the name and be like, oh, the top's not in there, therefore it's fine. You want to make sure that you're assessing it for that, what is my FRAC code, and also what are my products. And then once again, in particular, neither Inspire Super or Revis Top are recommended for Concord, but the example still stands. Additionally, you want to be evaluating your product choices at various times of year, particularly the difference between, do I want to be using a contact or a systemic right now? So bad weather will wash off your contacts, which means they're no longer providing any sort of control. A contact would be something like sulfur. Sulfur is only as good as the area of is the coverage you can get it. So if you have bad weather or you had bad conditions during your spray and you don't have great coverage, they're not going to be as effective. Whereas our systemics are absorbed into the plant to some extent. There's some variation within the systemic category and how absorbed they are. But these guys can tolerate rain/poor coverage better than your contacts. So if you're in that critical control period of immediate pre-bloom to immediate post-bloom, and you've unfortunately got poor weather, you know, this is not where you want to be relying on your contacts. You know, if you spray Manzate and it's just washed off by 2 days of thunderstorms, versus if you had sprayed, you know, let's say you sprayed Revis or not Revis, well, maybe you would have sprayed Revis, Vivando or Quintec for your powdery mildew, then, you know, you'd get that staying power. And then instead of Manzate, pretend that I said sulfur, because I switched to powdery mildew in the middle of that example. Additionally, too, you always want to be keeping an eye on your pre-harvest intervals, and particularly the 66-day pre-harvest interval for Mancozeb products.
Katie, I'm sorry, I have a couple questions. If you
don't apologize. That's what this is for.
Thank you. So one is, has there been more work done on the economics of dormant sprays? Older work showed it did not reduce inoculum of powdery mildew enough to pay for itself. So better to spend the money on a JMS stylet oil or something similar during the season as a tank mix. That was one question.
I would agree with that assessment. To my knowledge, there's been no work done disproving what Wayne found in terms of the economics of a dormant spray. I really only recommend a dormant spray if you have no other option, or if you just cannot find any reason not to do it, such as you're trying to manage organically. So like true organic, not just trying to do low input. And you just you're kind of faced with no other option. I think rarely does a dormant spray really get you what you need unless you're trying to manage organically. And it's still truly, it's just like the nastiest thing. So I think dormant spray is rarely called for. Also, like generally pre-bud break management just doesn't, it's just not worth it. Next time I give this talk, I'll be sure to expand upon that point. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. That was it so far.
Oh, that was it so far. Okay.
Sorry.
So now I'm gonna jump right back into where I was. And product intervals in response to disease pressure. This is kind of something that I've hinted at and kind of threaded through the rest of the talk. You want to be using shorter intervals when disease pressure is high and when weather is conducive. Also, you're able to get away with longer intervals when your pressure is low or when conditions are not favorable to disease. So in that, that critical control period, that's when you definitely want to be going with your 10-day intervals, your shorter intervals for control versus, we're kind of in the mid to late season. We're having a nice, hot, dry August, where we got lucky this year. Maybe you could stretch things then. So you always want to be paying attention to how much pressure is actually in my vineyard and what is the weather doing in choosing your interval length. And this is especially so if you're using a contact product, something like a sulfur manzate, that it needs physical presence, like actual stay on the leaf to be effective and doesn't have any kind of residual action from that absorbency, such as a product like Quintic, Bovando, Torino would. And then the final point here is that remember inherent resistance in the grapevine, it's your friend. We are fortunate, though, we do have a number of diseases that are all trying to eat our grapes at the same time we're trying to grow them. That grapevine is fortunately not susceptible to all diseases all season long. And you only want to spray during your periods of susceptibility. So you don't get any control for powdery mildew if you're pre-bud break. You don't need to be controlling for black rot once we get into post-veraison time. You don't need to be thinking about botrytis in the early season. Remember, we have this as, and then also too, the most important example of this, our berries become resistant to powdery, downy, and black rot in juice grapes after about 2 to 3 weeks. If there is anyone who's growing vinifera, this, maybe I'm a little more conservative on this estimate, I would say about 4-ish weeks after post-bloom. You get that resistance 4 to 5 weeks. So now just kind of reviewing some fungicide resistance stewardship practices for commonly used products. One thing I will note is that I have not included anything on the DMIs in here, since many of them are not recommended for Concord as they cause injury. But if they were to be on here, they would be in this first category of 3 times per year. So your SDHI products, important examples, your Luna family, the Luna half, not the Luna Sensation, T or E, whatever they throw in there. Aprovia and Endura should not be used more than 3 times per season and never twice in a row. Your QOI products or your strobulurins, these are more common, Abound, Azaka, Reason, Sovereign, Top Guard EQ, as well as Rhyme. These should not be used more than 3 times per season as well and never twice in a row. Now, if you do feel like your vines need some downy control, you should not be using Rebus and Zampro more than 3 times, per season and never twice in a row. I doubt we would ever have this problem in Concord. But just be aware that it's important to not do, I'm gonna keep saying this like a broken record, never twice in a row, never twice in a row. That is truly the worst thing you could do in terms of breaking the fungicide stewardship rules. Now, when twice a year is the cap, Vivando and Prolivo, these guys are in the same frac family. These products should not be used more than twice per season, and again, never twice in a row. Gattin, our new product, is a unique MOA. In order to preserve it, I recommend not using it more than twice per season, and again, never twice in a row. And then Torino and Quintic, these are in separate groups, but I'm just not going to repeat it again for the sake of not sounding like a broken record. Don't use it more than twice per season, and again, never twice in a row. And then while I don't really think this is of strong interest or use case in Concord, I did want to mention that Ridamil for Downy Mildew should never be used more than once per season. It is truly the best product we've ever developed for Oomycete control. And it is also, I would say, probably it goes, Downy Mildew goes resistant to it like gangbusters. It's like, it's just dreaming of it. It is super resistance prone. And I've seen in my previous life as a potato and vegetable pathologist, mefenoxam resistance is truly the worst thing that I've ever seen. So really do not want to apply this more than once per season.
Katie, I do have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a grower who was asking me questions about Gattin.
Yeah.
Since it is new,
yeah,
and they actually have it available to them,
yeah,
their normal program starts with either, I got to read what I was, either Vivando or Endura as the pre-bloom and immediate post. Really happy with what they've been doing, but would like to try Gattin and wondering if they replaced one of those, they're so worried that they're not, like, what's the research behind it? What have you seen?
Right. Yeah, so Gattin was tested for years by Wayne, both in its name Gattin as it's owned by Nicino, and also when it was a numbered compound from Valent before. So it does provide, I would say Vivando still provides better control. But I would say I don't think you're risking that much by giving it a try. I would not knock out Vivando though, because I love Vivando. Don't tell Syngenta. I think it's a wonderful product. Endura really does provide great control as well. If you're only going to be applying, if you're looking to apply two, I think it would be fine to try Gattin, but I would not, I would maybe go with your post-bloom spray rather than your immediate pre-bloom, because your immediate pre-bloom, that is like the most important one that you make. So and that maybe that's a little like more social science than true like recommendation. If you're interested in trying this product, I would give it a try with, put it in the second most important slot. Also too, you don't need to spray it everywhere, right? Like you could give it a test. I recommend giving it a test, like pick like 1 or 2 blocks and gotten a test this year. And if you like it, do it more next year. We don't have to do everything everywhere.
Thanks. Okay, there's another question that popped up as you were speaking. Thank you. It says, though the threat of downy and powdery is reduced on the berries after bloom, should you continue strong control on the leaves because of canopy damage, thus hindering ripening?
Yes, so that is why we can't just drop our PM and DM control after the cluster period. Both powdery mildew and downy mildew will require control nearly through harvest to prevent disease from taking off on the canopy, which, as you mentioned, will impact ripening. But the kind of stringency with our control can be more relaxed. So this is when we can start going with longer intervals. We can start using, this is not necessarily where you want to be using your Vivando. You want to put Vivando in that like critical control spot. Maybe you can go back to sulfur, though you have to take that up with your juice processor. I don't know if there is like angry about sulfur as the winemakers are. I apologize. I'm still getting to know the industry. So you do need control on the canopy, but you also want to be making those decisions with respect to what you're seeing in your vineyard, like and also like what the environment is. If you've got like a really rainy kind of post bloom time and also like a rainy post foragen, then like you want to be controlling for these diseases. If you've got nice dry, you always want to be controlling, but like you want to be controlling more stringently. If it's really kind of nice and dry and like you've got a really clean, you were really great about your cluster control, there's nothing showing up, you can probably stretch your intervals a bit. And I'm not saying stretch them to 21 days, but maybe like you could go back to your sulfur, you could go back to your contact, you don't have to be worried about stuff getting washed off. So it's not that you don't, like you should maintain control, but the level of kind of the intensity of your control can lessen in that just that canopy control period. I hope that helps. Thank you. More questions or should I go on?
No, you can go on. There's no more questions just yet. Thanks.
Cool. Okay, so I think, am I running up on time, Jen, or am I good?
You are doing absolutely fantastic on time because this, for credits, we have to talk for at least an hour on IPM, and this will definitely satisfy that. So
okay, great. So now I'm going to transition into the next part of the talk that's like a little less review and more kind of focused on research that we were able to undergo last summer. So I want to take a second to introduce biopesticides. So thinking about all these absolute, concerns with these chemistries, our synthetic chemistries have an absolutely critical place in our control. And I don't see biopesticides as something that should replace them. I see biopesticides as something that can preserve them so that we can rely on them for decades to come. Thinking about how quickly we lost azoxystrobin, our QOIs, within its introduction. And I've been genuinely impressed by the quality of the recently released biopesticide products. But if you're interested in using biopesticides, it's important to understand that they work different from our traditional chemistries. And I like to think of them as like very strong locks on a door, keeping a thief out, with the thief being the pathogen. So your biopesticides will improve your plant's defense against pathogens. Many of them are defense inducers. But if you have a particularly crafty or particularly determined thief, they can still make it in. They can pick the lock and get in. So if you have particularly conducive conditions, a particularly susceptible host, or a really virulent pathogen, they can break through much more easily than they can with a synthetic. And additionally, too, your biopesticides are not going to do anything for you if your thief is already inside the house when you lock the door. If you've already got infection, it's, inducing defense. It's like, it really doesn't get you much. So they're really great for protectants, and they need to be used differently from our chemistries. We can do 1 shot of Vivondo and it does really well for 14 days. Biopesticides, using them continuously throughout the season really magnifies their growth, and especially use kind of like starting in the earlier season through the end of the season. So some new biopesticides that we were testing out last summer. Regalia is not new, but we were working with some new products from AgBiome, particularly one from called Howler, which has been recently approved for powdery mildew control. Some from Marone, Regalia, Stargus. Wilbur Ellis has a new product called Romeo, as well as the kind of go-tos from Assertis, one of the really great product called Lifeguard, as well as Oso. So we were testing these out for powdery control and downy control, used in rotation with traditional chemistries. So I'm not going to go in detail through this graph just for boredom's sake, but what I do want the main takeaway for powdery control to be is that across the board, we found that both our straight biopesticide programs and our mixed biopesticide synthetic programs provided excellent severity control and then good to moderate incidence control. So I want to say that the excellent severity control really harkens back to how these pesticides were defense inducers. There we go, I got it. So they're able to keep our infections from spiraling out of control. So if you have you've got a big bad thief in the house, the lock isn't going to keep him out. But what we actually are seeing is that it's reducing how bad things get. And I do want to say that our BioPs and synthetic rotations really provided the best control. And I do want to caveat this is one season of data, as well as it was a particularly favorable year for grapes, not so favorable for disease. Our best performing combinations for powdery mildew control were Lifeguard, Regalia, and Fracture, a rotation of Lifeguard and Gattin, and then Howler used with Gattin throughout the season, Lifeguard and Vivondo, Howler and Vivondo. And what's really interesting is we found that all of our best performer biopesticide rotations were statistically equivalent to using just the synthetic only. So alternating between Lifeguard and Vivondo, alternating between Howler and Vivondo, was equivalent to the control that we received from just using Vivondo straight through, which gives me a lot of hope that they can be used for reducing the pressure we put on these really effective chemistries for control, and thus preserve them longer for use. Now, thinking about downy control, once again, we saw the same trend, excellent severity control, and then we had moderate incidence control. Overall, I would say that the BioPs we tried were better for powdery incidence than they were for downy incidence. Our best combos, not shockingly, Lifeguard and Britomil Gold, Lifeguard and Zampro, and then Lifeguard, Zampro, and Brandman. And once again, we saw that these rotations of biopesticides and synthetics were statistically equivalent to the control we received with the synthetic only, which is, again, I find really exciting. So last season, we wanted to start this, but then we had a global pandemic and Cornell made us cancel it. But this summer, we're starting a new biopesticide control for black rot study within our Niagara pathology vineyards. So this is because we know that black rot is poorly controlled by copper, which poses a barrier to expanded organic juice grape production in New York State, of which there is growing consumer demand. So this year is going to be the first of a 3-year study in our Niagara Path vineyards to determine if these new biopesticide products that we've seen that are efficacious for powdery and downy control are also efficacious for black rot, which would be really wonderful if we could say, like, hey, of the 3 biggest early season diseases, these products are effective, and not only are they effective, they can help fill a gap that could potentially expand an industry with great consumer interest, which could be organic juice grape production. So I'm really excited about this. Yeah.
Sorry, I thought you were done. I thought there was a pause. I apologize.
No.
There is a question about the study that you were just showing.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, what were the spray intervals, and when did the first spray start?
That's a great question. So our first spray of the season for both PM and DM was June 1st last year. And our intervals, because of Cornell mandates, we weren't able to like kind of wiggle them a bit with the time of year. We pretty much stuck to 14-day intervals throughout the season. So I think we yielded 7 total sprays last year. So we got a bit of a late start. So yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. So I'm really excited for this black rot study to begin. And then additionally, our plans for the 2021 season, just kind of some other studies, we'll be continuing our powdery mildew trial. Actually, we're totally booked out. Every single panel is booked, which we're really excited about in both our powdery and our downy study, as well as our new black rot trial. We'll additionally be carrying on our botrytis trial, as well as doing a second year of a sour rot timing trial with the Loeb lab in order to better refine how many late season sprays are needed to control sour rot. And additionally, too, this is funded through the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant Initiative. We're doing a FRAC 40 resistance survey. This is Revis and then the half of Zampro. So if you suspect that you might have Revis resistance in your vineyard, though I'm going to guess this is probably a little less of a concern in our Concords, just please reach out and get it tested. It's going to help us understand the scope of the problem more broadly. You can either email myself or Jen to sign up for a kit or to get contacted for sampling later in the season. And additionally, too, with support from the New York Wine and Grape Foundation, as well as the Western New York grape juice grape growers, particularly through Welch's, I'm very grateful to say that we now have support for infrastructure investments in our pathology vineyards. This season, we're doing replants in our Chardonnay. This is our home to our powdery mildew and downy mildew trial. Additionally, we're establishing a new acre of vineyards of Traminette in the 2022 season. So we've been doing a lot of work to get all of our trellises up to speed. This year I think the viticulturists are going to kill me. We reoriented our vignoles. They went from mid-wire cordon to top wire cordon, and they're looking beautiful. I hope I said that right. Jen is laughing at me. And we're just really excited to help, kind of give these vineyards the love that they need to keep being the wonderful resource that they've been for decades more. So with that, I did want to leave. Yeah. So I did want to leave plenty of time for questions. I also wanted to mention that grape disease control, my version of Wayne's magnum opus, though his at last glance was 81 pages, mine is only 27 pages. But I also have not had the long historic career that Wayne has had. This is now available on the Gold Lab website, also via the regional newsletters. If you can't get a hold of it, I can send out the link or just talk to Jen. Additionally, please feel free to email me at any time with questions. I'm a pandemic assistant professor. It's been really hard not being able to get to know the community. So I'd love to hear from you all. So with questions, I'm just gonna leave this table up in the background for us to start we've been getting great questions throughout, but if we wanted to do some more now, I thought this would be a nice little background for that.
Just received a message that said, could you please make sure that it's never 81 pages? And the update was great.
Oh, I appreciate, thank you for the positive feedback. And I have been told by multiple people not to make mine 81 pages. I do expect it to creep up a bit over the years, but I don't think it'll ever be 81 pages.
There's another one that came in that says, does Katie have any thoughts about using the disease models on NUA to assist in timing of spray intervals?
Oh, that's a great question. I have lots of thoughts on that. Actually, so I wanted to really focus this on IPM, but one of the projects we have ongoing is actually trying to take DMcast in particular and integrate it with satellite imagery in order to improve its utility for timing of important sprays. So right now, DMcast is based solely on environmental parameters, and it doesn't actually take into account either pathogen physical presence or whether or not we actively have disease in any area. So we're working with Planet Labs. Excuse me, I'm sorry for all of this. I'm very pregnant and talking a lot makes weird things happen. So Planet Labs is a commercial satellite provider, and they provide imagery with spanning 50 centimeters, from space, up to 5 meters in length. So what we want to do is integrate kind of simple health metrics from these satellites. These are not the satellites that can do crazy detection or differentiation, but they can do quite a bit when they're used intelligently. So I have a computer science student who's working on using some wild, cool deep learning stuff that I don't fully understand, and I don't claim to integrate spectroscopic imagery. So basically indexes of plant health, like where the grapes look bad, where the grapes look good, into DMCAS to see if that can help improve this tool's utility for timing precision sprays. Additionally, too, we're trying to build a partnership with a company that would allow us to evaluate miniature weather stations for their use in terms of refining the spatial resolution. We know that disease pressure is quite variable within a block. Like everyone knows the one corner of their vineyard that's just like, if we're gonna get bad downy, it's always gonna be here first, sort of thing. So we're trying to see if improving the spatial resolution of our environmental data can also improve DMCAS utility for timing precision sprays. So that's kind of, those are my thoughts on the NUA models for spray timing.
Nice. I don't have any more questions in the chat right now. So.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna take a bite of my grilled cheese. I will admit, this is my, what is it, my second grilled cheese of the day. I'm at that stage of late pregnancy.
Well, I'm glad that we were able to move up this meeting anyways and get you here to talk with our growers about this. So thank you.
I wouldn't have missed it. I love these meetings. I love working with you, Jen.
Thank you. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to unmute and ask them.
Yeah, go for it.
I know there are also many on the call who are not just Concord growers. So if you have any, this is not meant to exclude.
Yes, true.
So if you have any, if you want to ask, please do. Nice job. Katie, did you have any more you wanted to go over slides, or is that the end of them?
No, that was the end of the slide deck that I prepared.
Perfect. Do you want to stop sharing and we can all be on face-to-face?
Sure thing.
Good.
All right.
Katie, this is Kevin Martin.
Hi.
When you're looking for the resistance in Revis, I can't remember the chemistry exactly. Are you looking, so we use a lot of Revis top in the hybrids that you can use it in and in Niagara's. Are you looking for the Revis part or the top part?
That's a great question. We are looking for the Revis top.
Okay.
The Revis
The
part,
Revis.
not the top.
Okay.
So we're looking for FRAC 40 resistance, which was first found in 2016, reported in 2018, has now been documented in the East Coast in our region. I think it would have been documented more if Wayne had been kind of on the edge of retirement, kind of like that lull period between the two programs. But thanks for that.
Is this the same in conjunction with, is it Michelle Moyer in Washington State?
So this is yes and no. So our survey is in conjunction with Tim Miles, who is part of Michelle Moyer's larger frame network project. We're kind of riding the coattails. So we are doing quite a bit of sampling for powdery mildew resistance as well for strobilurine products. So I do want to put that out. I should have mentioned that. If you suspect that you might have FRAC 11 / strobilurine / QOI / abound resistance, do get in contact as well, as we can hook you up with a sampling kit and as well as some guidelines on what to do if you do find resistance.
Okay, thank you. I did have another question pop up.
Great.
Sure. Oh, well, sorry, that was actually meant for me. Just a suggestion for future coffee pot meeting research. So sorry.
Great.
Anybody have any questions for Katie? Because I don't want to take too much of her time. So if you do have some, if you want to send it to me privately in the chat and I'll get it asked for you if you don't want to ask yourself. Otherwise, we'll give her about.
Katie.
Oh, good. Hi, Larry.
Hi. I heard you talking about the EBDCs in a contact. And if it rains, it loses effectiveness. But I always think, as hard as it is to get off your equipment, how could rain wash it off?
That's a good question. I mean, so think about, so it kind of gets into how sulfur actually kills the pathogen. So sulfur kills spore germination. So yes, you do have some say. It's not like rain will like make you go from like 100 to 0, but it will reduce. And especially with sustained periods of rain over time, you get that reduction daily, 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 daily. So in order for sulfur to be effective, the sulfur has to be physically present where the powdery mildew spore lands. So as you're losing that coverage with rain over time, you're not, obviously, once again, you're not going from 100 to 0 with a single day's worth of rain. You're losing coverage in terms of where a powdery mildew spore will be killed instantly. So that's kind of how to think about it. So you're increasing the surface area that's not protected, but you're not losing control entirely. So that's why, it's not like, so, that's why you want to pay attention to the weather. You don't want to go spray sulfur the day before a massive thunderstorm. But it's also why we still do recommend that kind of 7 to 10 day interval, especially during rainy periods of 7 days. Like, you will get some control from it, but it will be lessened, and it's lessened more and more and more over time with the expanding duration of the rain.
Katie, I'm assuming your answer would be
talking about EBDCs.
Yeah, I'm assuming it would be a similar answer for EBDCs.
I'm sorry, EBDC.
Mancozeb?
Oh, okay, mancozeb. Yes, so mancozeb also works similarly to sulfur, but it's less washed off. And it has more of a broad spectrum control, but mancozeb's primary target in terms of what part of the life cycle it kills is not, so sulfur is more spore germination kind of, but it also a little bit of like spores that have just started to get in there. Mancozeb is both spore germination entirely, so spore lands, kill spore, plus like the spores that have just started, mancozeb will get those. If you've already got a nice established one though, mancozeb doesn't do that. And once again, it has to be in physical contact with the organism. So it's not systemic in that a systemic product will go into the leaf and then it'll spread out a little bit. So if you don't have great coverage, you get a little bit back, depending on the product, it may spread out a little bit within the plane of the leaf. It may spread out a little even more if we're thinking about something like Prophyte. But with both your mancozeb products and your sulfur products and other general Captan and Xyram, they only cover and they only protect where they hit the plant. They don't spread out any further outside of the whatever you do get from the spreader sticker that you use. In terms of their fungicide actual mechanism of action.
If I could add a little bit here, we did a study. This is Brian Head.
Oh, hey Brian! I thought I recognized.
Hi,
that
Katie. I'll unmask myself here. Sorry. We did a study just to kind of go along with what Katie said. We did a study a few years ago to look at the rain fastness of mancozeb and I think Xyram. And we did find that just with small amounts of rain, as little as 1/4 of an inch, we lost up to 75% of the residue on leaves. And if you got up to about an inch and a half, 2 inches, of course, we were only able to recover about 10, maybe 15% of that original residue after an inch to 2 inches of rain. So it definitely does wash off. Mm-hmm. Now, we also found that, however, that it doesn't take a lot of mancozeb to control downy mildew, black rot, things like that. When we applied amounts of mancozeb and Xyram to leaves that were equivalent to what you'd have left after an inch or two of rain, we found that it still controlled those diseases. So it's kind of overkill to apply 4 pounds per acre, but what you end up with after 10, 14 days is still, enough in a lot of cases to control the disease, but only what you hit and only what gets well stuck. And so that's the reason I think that, if you applied 1 pound, you'd end up with not enough to control diseases after an inch of rain. Whereas, when you apply the 3 to 4 pound rate, you get a lot of it washing off, but you get enough of it that hangs on for a week or two to continue to provide you with some disease control. given the fact that, you've got good coverage.
That's a great point, Brian. Thank you. I remember reading that study and I should have brought it up, but I'm glad you're here to do it for me. Who's got more questions for us?
I have a question. This is Jason.
Hi, Jason.
In that study, Brian, did you add any spreader sticker with the Manzate, or did you just go with what it was in?
I think if I remember correctly, we did not add any spreader stickers. So that would probably help.
Mhm.
I know, and there's different formulations, of course, of Mancozeb. We've had everything from Roper and I don't know, some other generic ones that to Manzate Pro Stick, which I think is one of the better ones probably. That's highly formulated to really last a good long time. But you'll probably pay a little bit more for it too.
Brian, I know that with the Manzate Pro Stick on apples that, and I'm trying to think of her name, pathologist at Biglerville. Oh, geez.
Oh, I know who you're talking about. I can see her face.
Yes, me too. Okay, but she's done a lot of work with the apples, and she, highly recommends the Mancozeb Pro Stick. And again, that's, I think, just because of the adjuvant that they put in there. So I would think that if they add with an adjuvant with the Mancozeb products, that you would get
Right. That should help. That should help.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in, one of the things we're seeing is kind of a run on adjuvants. So we're seeing some costs of things go up, and adjuvants is one of them now. And I think Brian mentioned sometimes you pay more for Pro Stick, but it's not a lot more. And sometimes, if you're shopping around, it might not be anything more for something like Pro Stick compared to Roper. But a lot of times it's like $1 an acre. And if you find you need the adjuvant, you end up spending more.
And that's another thing I think we should add. When we say adding an adjuvant, that doesn't mean 3 times the amount that's recommended. Because I've had growers say, well, I'm going to put, more because then it'll last even longer. That's not what we mean. And, you got to look at the label too, to see if they ask for adjuvants or not, because again, some are formulated right in there with the product and others are not. So you do have to pay attention to that.
Katie, at what kind of temperatures or minimum temperatures do things like powdery mildew and black rot actually grow at? I mean, the temperature is not forecast to be very warm for the next week. So,
right. So given the stage of grape growth plus the weather, I would say that neither. So I'm gonna just say juice draw poll. We're at kind of like 1 to 3, 1 to 5 shoot growth for those who have it. Nothing more than 5, right? Yeah, so I would say that given the cool conditions, I would not consider those diseases to be of a concern right now. Once we start, I think it's like, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, it's like 60, 62 or something. That's when we start to get powdery mildew being active, but the real sweet spot for powdery is once we hit above 68. And then off the top of my head, I just can't remember the minimum threshold for black rot.
Yeah, I know black rot tends to operate at warmer temperatures than Phomopsis. Phomopsis is really the only thing we're concerned about at this point in time.
Right.
That can operate at 48 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
Great questions, everybody. Please keep them coming. We'll give the awkward silence for about a minute. And see.
Did I see a question about a garden gnome or something?
I saw that. I was going to ask you to answer it because I don't know Penn State.
I had a grower call and ask me because of that weather forecast. So I don't know if other growers are thinking this, but what if it's not 48 degrees? What if it's 47 degrees? Or what if it's 48 degrees for 5 minutes?
Andy got it.
I mean, like, it's not like a light switch goes off, and it's not like it's like, whoop, time to cause disease. Like, you know, this is our best estimate as pathologists studying these organisms that unfortunately don't talk back. So actually, maybe fortunately, like,
Good thing they don't, yeah.
right? Yeah, like, could you imagine walking through your vineyard and Powdery's just like, I'm gonna eat your grapes, like, so I mean, you know, take the wiggle room. I would not like 47 versus 48. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, and if it's 47 in your vineyard, it might be 49 in somebody else's.
Exactly, right?
Down the road.
And it might be 49 just, you know, down the hill, up the hill. So.
Or in different parts of your vineyard, your same vineyard. So.
Hey, Brian and Andy, this is Tim.
Oh, look, his camera's on.
I knew that, Weigel.
Hey, Tim.
Nice beard, Andy.
Hi, Tim.
That was a garden gnome reference from our friend Benkel.
Yes. But
I've always
in
just
the
heard Santa
past-
Claus, not the garden gnome, but that's
Yes,
good.
But in the past, you know, when we've had years like this where forecasted rain, temperatures in the lower 50s, it always seemed like the length of the infection periods were really important to look at, especially with Phomopsis that we're looking at. And that's where, if you have a newest station close to you and you can look at that, but looking at that forecast and just how much rain is expected during the cold temperatures, I think is also an important consideration.
Mm-hmm. I second.
Yeah, I think, what was it, 2017, we had that horrific Phomopsis event. And I think we had, 48, maybe 72 hours in some places of almost continuous wetness. And the average temperature actually bumped down below what we would expect Phomopsis to operate at. But, because some of those temperatures were above what it would operate at, we still had an infection period. And it was a really, really bad one. And we didn't have temperatures were hovering in the upper 40s to the lower 50s. So very cool. Very what we would consider marginal maybe, but that was in 21 years, that was the worst Phomopsis event I've ever seen. It was everywhere in every vineyard, on every Concord vine, almost on every shoot on every Concord vine in Erie County that I looked at.
And it probably was the earliest. I think that's why, that kind of caught us by surprise. That's why, in the guide, and we say like the 3 to 5 inch is most of the time when we talk about Phomopsis. But that really caught us off guard, that 1 inch, 1.5 inch.
That was more like 2 inches of growth at that time. And, guys had not been thinking about putting anything on quite yet. And fortunately, I think because of that, we didn't see the amount of cluster damage that we could have seen if it was 5 inches of shoot growth. We saw a lot of lesions on the first and second internode, but it didn't quite get to that first inflorescence, at least not very often, except in maybe the places that were out the most, farthest from the lake. But we kind of dodged a bullet there in another sense.
I do have a question that popped up in the chat box to me, and it is Abound worth using anymore on Concords? We've not used it in quite a few years. Could it be used in any rotation?
Not in Erie County.
Yeah, unfortunately, QI resistance is quite widespread. So, yeah.
And in fact, I did send some powdery mildew samples in for strobilurin resistance last year. And I haven't talked to Tim Miles yet, who I think his lab is the one that looked at those. Yeah. But from the way it looked, every sample I sent in, and this was just from Erie County, Pennsylvania, was resistant. And that's powdery mildew to the strobilurins. they had the resistance gene, all of the isolates that were sent in from Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I sent some PM to Tim as well. So unfortunately, his lab got hit hard by the shutdowns. Two of his lab members actually had COVID, so a lot of their testing for 2020 is pretty delayed. But of the isolates I did send them that they were able to get to, we had pretty extensive resistance as well.
Yeah.
Oof.
I've still got to confirm that those were the ones from Erie County, but all the ones that were sent from Pennsylvania to the Michigan State lab came back resistant.
Yikes.
Yeah,
I
I
do have
almost
another
think a more interesting question would be, and I've heard growers say different things in their observations, is I think at where a bound is priced, and this is just a bound, so nothing in Pennsylvania. If it was effective on downy and black rot, you could probably make the case that it has a place in a spray program. But growers sort of go back and forth on whether it actually is. So I don't know if any resistance has actually been found.
So QOY resistance in downy mildew has not been studied out extensively, but it has been documented. I would say that I would be very hesitant to recommend strobilurin for downy mildew control used alone, and especially would not recommend that choice be made during the most critical control period. I do know that Maren Brewer has a student who's surveying FRAC 11 QOI resistance in black rot. We sent her some samples last summer. I think as well, they've been impacted by the lab shutdowns and their testing is delayed.
I know there was a study, it was probably about 10 years ago now. You remember, it was a graduate student of Wayne Wilcox, Christopher Gee, who then went on to work at Behrend here in Erie County for Penn State. And he conducted a study one summer with some of his students where they collected isolates and looked at strobilurin resistance from downy mildew specifically. And at that time, I believe what they found was that it was not really there yet.
Okay.
But that was, like I say, that was 10 or could have been 10 years ago or more even. Maybe not quite that long ago, but nothing has been done recently. And,
Hey, Brian.
we don't use them like they do in the Finger Lakes because 90% of our acreage is conquered, not susceptible. The pressure just isn't there, but
I also
not to say it's not happening.
Yeah, I do want to mention just a note about QOI resistance. So when you lose one, you lose them all. So if you have a bound resistance, you've also got you've also got rime resistance. You lose them all. It's just the same mechanism. So just something to note too when you're thinking about it. And then it's different from DMIs where we see for some reason difenoconazole still works pretty well when some of the other guys are slipping. Just as a note when thinking about where you might want to use these products for control.
There was another question. I'm sorry, go ahead, Andy.
I was going to say, we've had anecdotal evidence from growers for the last so many years saying that sovereigns seem to be slipping for powdery. And
I'm sure,
hear that a lot about the strobilurins and even the DMIs. So I think that's why, especially in the Grape guide, it's emphasized not to use the strobilurins or the DMIs for powdery.
Yep.
At that immediate post bloom spray. And we have enough products that are good powdery mildew products that we don't have to use those at that time.
Exactly. Yeah. And also too, just as a note, so DMIs, this for just everyone's knowledge. So I'm I trained in mycete biology, so they have a special place in my heart because I'm a crazy pathologist. DMI fungicides actually have no efficacy at all on downy mildew. They target a component of true fungi that mycetes do not have. So sometimes we'll say we don't recommend DMIs and QOIs for powdery or downy alone, but just note that when we're saying that, the reason we're not recommending DMIs for powdery and downy is different. DMIs have never had any efficacy on downy, and we don't recommend them alone for powdery now because we've seen control slipping due to the development of resistance.
I think one important point, though, is that if you have a black rot problem,
the
DMIs and if you have to put it in pre or post, that would be a good choice, but just not alone for powdery.
Exactly. That's a great
Something
point.
in.
We have a Downy Mildew question, if you guys would please entertain it. It says, have you done research on various levels of additional spreader sticker used in EBDC in addition to what may be in the product, you know, to get good penetration and contact? Anyone?
I haven't done anything like that.
Yeah.
One thing I would say is, though, a lot of times in the product, that stuff is sort of proprietary. So you don't actually know what adjuvant is in there with some of these companies. So I think that might be difficult. I mean, Katie or Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's one of the things that, you know, those adjuvants and those mixes, a lot of times we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, wasn't Wayne doing something with
Wayne was always doing something.
well, I thought I heard that toward the end of his career, maybe even now, I don't know, that somebody was, I thought it was Wayne, that was actually doing a trial to look at specific surfactants and
Well, yeah, and that's been in our botrytis trial. So that started
Okay.
with Wayne and I carried this on. So we
So
found, yeah, so that's why we found that adjuvant has no impact at all on control of botrytis. Also, just as a note, Wayne didn't mention this to me at all. He just kind of left it in the records. And when I brought it up, I'm like, hey, you started this trial. This sounds really important. He's like, oh, you found it. I'm like, yeah, I found like kind of like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But yeah, so he did start that work in botrytis.
Okay.
And then we have, this will be our last season of collection for it before. But that's why I think we've got 3 years already and it's showing like no difference at all.
I know when you buy the, Andy, I think when you buy the surfactants by themselves, though, they do list the chemical that's in those surfactants.
Right.
It's only proprietary when it's the, you know, like the inert ingredients on a pesticide, like for Quintec or something like that, you know. There you'll never find out what that is.
Mm-hmm.
I do not want to stop this conversation because I think it's going very well. Please keep asking your questions. I am just going to interject that I'm going to start the poll. So it's up there for you to do it. You lose your before you leave. This is only if you are getting pesticide recertification credits. You have to answer the polls to do that. And there are a couple questions there. No rush. Please keep the conversation going, but I want to make sure I fulfill that for the DEC. Thank you.
This is Tim again. And we used to have good conversations on the adjuvants and the fact that if the pesticide doesn't actually call for them on the label, is it worthwhile spending the money to add them? Because there are pesticides that say use with this spreader or this adjuvant. So I just wondered if, Katie, if you had any thoughts on that?
That's a really good question. I think that also kind of gets into like one of the questions that Wayne was looking to get at with, so we're using Luna E as our base in the botrytis trial for that. But it's a really good question. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know of any other research that would address that, though.
That's kind of the answer we always came up with too.
Right. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Nobody ever really did specific work with that. I think we kind of kept to the idea that, you know, the labels are going to recommend, they're going to want to put their best face forward. And if you need something, or if they think you require something else, say that on the label. But if not, then unless there's research actually done to show that there's a benefit, there's no reason to think that there is. Does that sound like?
And I think, Tim, we used to say, you know, if you read the label and it asks for it, definitely put it in. You know, then you really should put it in. But if it doesn't, then we don't have enough information one way or the other to tell you if it's better.
we would just be guessing otherwise.
Yeah. The other thing I think it is important with the adjuvants is make sure, and this goes also with insecticides, and I'll use, say, Movento as an example. They do tell you that you should be using a spreader sticker or spray adjuvant with Movento, but one of them that I think Greg had done some work with this, Greg Loeb, don't use induce. So you have to be careful with that, depending on the product and what the label does say. And with the Movento, I guess they found injury using the adjuvant induce. So they tell you specifically not. So you got to be careful and look at the label and see what they do ask for.
Before we switch topics, though, I would really like to take the time to thank Katie for being here. Thank you, Brian, for chiming in as well. I've had lots of great private messages saying, great job, Katie. So I appreciate you coming in here.
Thank you all. I got one of the comments about my hands too. Yeah, my hands move at the speed of my voice. I can't do it without it. Wait till you finally get to see me in person one day. It's like, woo! It's been wonderful being here with you all.